3 registered sex offenders shared a one-story house at 2825 Northwest Avenue in Bellingham, Washington. 49-year-old Hank Adolf Ices owned the small blue house with a white picket fence and had been renting rooms to 68-year-old Victor Manuel Vasquez. After a while, a third man had moved in, 42-year-old James Allen Russell. A Level 3 offender had been released from prison 5 years earlier. Ices pleaded guilty in 1997 to raping a 13-year-old boy and was sentenced to 5.5 years. He'd been off supervision for about 2 years or so. Vasquez was convicted in 1991 for molesting several relatives, one of those relatives being his own daughter, Eve, and he was sentenced to 12 years. All 3 roommates were classified as Level 3 sex offenders under Washington law, the category the state reserves for people it considers most likely to reoffend. Their names, photographs, and home address were posted on the Whatcom County Sheriff's Sex Offender Notification website, a public tool that existed since Washington passed the nation's first community notification law in 1990. Neighbors told a reporter that the men kept to themselves and went out of their way to put people at ease. One neighbor, Cheryl Craig, said the men just really wanted to live the rest of their lives in peace. Afraid of community backlash, the roommates went indoors whenever children came outside to play. A man arrived at the house at about 7 p.m. on Friday, August 26, 2005, and introduced himself to Russell as an off-duty FBI agent. He said there was a hit list targeting Level 3 sex offenders, that 2 Level 3 offenders had already been killed, and that the matter was under investigation. He asked for beer. Russell said he didn't have any and didn't drink. The man made a cell phone call, and a van showed up, driven by a woman. He left for a few minutes and came back with a 12-pack of Coors. He told Russell not to worry about the van. It was just his partner. Then he sat outside with Ices, Vasquez, and Russell in lawn chairs, drinking beer and smoking Camel cigarettes. He already knew Ices and Vasquez's names and backgrounds and asked each of them to describe their offense history, which they did. He made calls on his cell phone to check on their backgrounds and told them he'd get their classifications reduced to protect them. Russell left at some point to go to the bank and get ready for a 10 p.m. work shift, then came back around 9:30 p.m. to check on the FBI man before heading to work. At the side door, he ran into the man, said he'd forgotten his wallet, and went downstairs to get it. The man told him, "Don't ever leave your wallet here again." Russell didn't see or hear Ices or Vasquez anywhere in the house. He left again and went to work at around 9:30 p.m. while the supposed FBI agent was still there. A neighbor told detectives that the previous night he heard a man talking loudly to the 3 men outside the house and recalled the FBI cap and the dark jogging suit with white stripes. He thought the man was well over 6 feet tall. He remembered the man drinking beer and talking about the court system, and that the man threw a beer can on the ground, which stood out because the occupants always kept their yard neat. That neighbor told police he heard what he thought were firecrackers coming from the direction of the house sometime between 9:10 and 9:30 p.m., and afterwards saw vehicle lights and a van pulling out of the driveway. A second neighbor told investigators she believed she heard gunshots from the direction of the house between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Russell called home to check on Vasquez at about 1:15 a.m. and got no answer, which surprised him because Vasquez was always up late working on his computers. At 3 a.m. he drove home on his lunch break to check on the house. He found the side door standing open and the hall light on. That's when he found the first body and left to call 911 from a nearby location. Responding officers found Hank Ices in the northwest bedroom in a pool of blood. A few feet away, near a running computer, they found Victor Vasquez, also dead. Ices was shot once, with the round entering near his right earlobe and exiting his left cheek fracturing his skull, and Vasquez was shot once with the gun in contact with his right temple, the round exiting his left eye. Investigators recovered 2 spent 9mm shell casings from the bedroom. The computer monitor near Vasquez's body was still displaying the Whatcom County website listing Level 3 sex offenders. A forensic exam of the computer showed that information on 3 Level 3 offenders had been pulled up the previous night between 9:30 and 10 p.m. ICE's Vasquez and a third man, David Ackley, who wasn't otherwise connected to the case, were on the hit list. An adult pornography site was also accessed on the same computer around that time. 5 days after the killings, on August 31st, the Bellingham Herald received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter said the victims' status as Level 3 sex offenders was the motive and promised more killings. It arrived with 2 33-cent stamps and a return address of P.O. Box 777. The writer explained why Russell had been spared. "I only allowed James Allen Russell to live so he could get the message out to others of his kind that I am coming for them," the letter read, signed with the name Agent Life. No one else on the writer's list was harmed, and police warned every offender named in the letter about the threat, according to the Herald. Investigators recovered a partial fingerprint on one of the beer cans. On September 8th, the State Crime Laboratory confirmed the print. A left thumbprint on a Coors Light beer can belonged to Michael Anthony Mullen. Lab analysis of the shell casings found they were 9mm rounds, with a high probability of having been fired from a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol. No prints were recoverable from the casings, and the gun itself was never found. A witness came forward and told investigators she drove Mullen to the house and picked him up later, but said she had no idea of what he was doing there. She also told investigators that Mullen was her friend and housemate. When detectives processed the friend's van, they found what appeared to be a blood smear on the passenger interior molding. On Monday, September 5, 2005, at 7 p.m., Mullen called Bellingham's 911 centre. He told the dispatcher he was responsible for killing Hank Ices and Victor Vasquez and wanted to turn himself in. The police went to the restaurant and arrested him while he was still on the phone with dispatchers. He identified himself as Mike Mullen. The detectives read him his rights. He waived them and agreed to talk. He was still wearing the dark warm-up suit with white stripes. Mullen gave investigators details about the killings that were not made public, that each victim was shot once in the head, and the caliber of the weapon, which police said helped confirm his account. He told them he shot each victim with a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic that he'd stolen from a friend, and that he left the friend a message explaining why he took it. He claimed authorship of the letter to the Bellingham Herald and correctly identified the P.O. box, the stamps, and the Agent Life signature. He asked investigators whether they found his fingerprints on the beer cans, explaining he brought gloves but forgot to put them on, and challenged them to find his prints on the shell casings, saying he coated them in gun oil first. Mullen described his motive differently at different points in the interview. At times he described himself as a thief and a con whose life had been wasted, and said killing sex offenders gave his life value. He told detectives that he was a victim of sexual abuse himself, though he said he never reported it at the time. Mullen also said that something had to be done, and that he believed longer sentences were needed and the registration and notification system on sex offenders didn't work. He insisted no one else was involved, but claimed others would take up his cause after he was locked up. Pressed for specifics about how he obtained the gun or travelled to and from the crime scene, he was inconsistent or evasive. He said the computer he used for research and letters was a public one at a Kinko's on Evergreen Way in Everett. He said he took a ferry to Orcas Island and threw the gun into the Puget Sound. Investigators found and interviewed the friend Mullen had been staying with. She said she owned a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic and recently discovered it missing, replaced with a pellet gun in her lockbox. On electronic media at her house, detectives found a note addressed to her and signed Michael. It read, in part, "You are going to be seeing and hearing a lot of things about me on the news, and some of it may be true. However, much of it will be media hype. Don't get me wrong, murder is not a solution, and what I did was also wrong. I can only pray that God will see my intentions were good. I'm sorry I could not tell you of my intentions. I have used you to accomplish my mission. Don't feel too fooled. After all, I have fooled the entire world, and this includes those I have been very close to. When you notice that the gun is missing and has been replaced by a pellet gun, rest assured that it was not your gun that I used to carry out my acts. In fact, your gun I threw into the Puget Sound shortly after we got it out of the pawn shop. I was afraid, with all the kids we had in the house." A similar note, addressed to a sibling, was found on a CD, but there's no verified information available about what it said. The friend's own account contradicts part of what Mullen told police. He told detectives he stayed in motels around the time of the murders and took taxis or hitchhiked to and from the crime scene. She, on the other hand, told investigators she drove him to Bellingham herself on the evening of August 26th so he could look at a possible rental on Northwest Avenue, dropped him off, then picked him up and drove him to buy beer, took him back and picked him up again later after he called. Phone records for the landline at the victim's house showed a call from Mullen's cell phone at 4:10 p.m. on the day of the murders, lasting about 2 minutes. Shortly before he contacted police, he told 2 family members he was responsible, and they insisted he turn himself in. Michael Anthony Mullen was born in 1969, and he lived in Whatcom County most of his life. His brother, Larry Mullen, said their parents worked running restaurants in Snohomish and Whatcom counties, and that he and his 3 siblings largely had to fend for themselves growing up. He said Michael struggled with bedwetting as a child, which Larry mistakenly described as one of the telltale signs of sexual abuse. Michael later said he was molested by a neighbor when he was in 2nd or 3rd grade, though he never reported it to authorities. He also quit school in the 8th grade and started drinking around that time, according to Larry. As an adult, Michael Mullen was convicted in 1993 of unlawful issuance of a bank check, and again in 1997 of theft, after taking $2,185 from an electronics dealer by telling the man he'd use it to arrange a cell phone deal. He served 2 prison terms in Washington for those offenses. Mullen married twice over the years and had 2 children, saying he'd gone to jail not long after the wedding, effectively ending the relationship. Records reviewed by the Seattle Times turned up numerous addresses associated with Mullen, including one in a gated community at Birch Bay, northwest of Bellingham, reflecting years of moving back and forth between Skagit and Whatcom counties. In 2003, according to California prison records, Mullen was convicted of vehicle theft there and spent about 18 months behind bars. He saw people murdered in there. He saw people being raped, Larry Mullen told the Seattle Times. When Mullen was paroled, he asked to leave California and live with family members, but the parole board said no. He returned to Washington anyway. Something happened to him inside that California prison, his brother said. Mullen had long struggled with alcohol, and in the months before the killings, he had also begun taking prescription medication like anti-anxiety pills, antidepressants, and sleeping pills. That summer, Mullen had been following the case of Shasta and Dylan Groney, 2 children abducted from their home outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in mid-May after 3 family members were killed. Joseph Edward Duncan III was the suspect. On July 13, 2005, Mullen began researching ISIS and Vasquez on the internet. That same day, Mullen looked at the sheriff's website listing the addresses of Bellingham sex offenders and chose some to visit. At his first court appearance on Tuesday, September 6, the 6'5" Mullen told a court official he wanted to represent himself and to plead guilty. Under court rules, he couldn't enter a plea until his arraignment the following week. He was held on $1 million bail. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Max Setter said at the time that he anticipated charging Mullen with 2 counts of premeditated murder, each carrying a sentence of 20 years to life. That assessment changed. Prosecutors formally charged Mullen on Thursday, September 8th, with 2 counts of aggravated murder, according to the Associated Press. At his arraignment roughly a week and a half after his initial confession, Mullen, now with 2 public defenders at his side, pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. This charge, under Washington law, carried either the death penalty or life in prison as the only possible sentences. The not guilty plea came as a surprise, given how openly Mullen claimed responsibility in letters to news outlets and in online postings. A defense lawyer with experience in death penalty cases, Tim Ford, told the Seattle Times that defendants in Mullen's position often do change their minds. Though state law also required prosecutorial consent for Mullen to plead guilty to aggravated first-degree murder during the 30-day window after arraignment. This was the period during which prosecutors were deciding whether to seek the death penalty. Questions about Mullen's mental state at the time of the killings were expected to be part of the case. At a court appearance about a week after his arrest, he sat weeping in the jury box. On Wednesday, March 8, 2006, Mullen pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder with a firearm, according to the Bellingham Herald. 2 days later, on Friday, March 10th, Whatcom County Superior Court Judge Ira Uhrig sentenced him to 44 years in prison. Mullen's attorney, Richard Fassey, told the court that the sentencing recommendation likely reflected an expectation that Mullen would die in prison. Passing sentence, Judge Uhrig told Mullen, "We are above all a nation of laws, but you took the law into your own hands. But perhaps even more accurately, you put yourself above the law, and in doing so, in some respect, you violated the rights of every citizen of our state and our nation. No civilized society would condone your actions." Mullen was sent to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Victor Vasquez's daughter Eve spoke publicly both immediately after the murders and again at sentencing. In a statement given to the Bellingham Herald days after the killings, she asked the people not to be angry at her father, and wrote that she was still reeling from the news, "which is of such a great caliber that I am sure I will never fully recover." She said she was uncertain how to continue in her everyday life with the knowledge that my father has been robbed from me by some vengeful stranger. Her father had been sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1991 for abusing children, including her, and had not been in trouble again after his release. Eve wrote that she worried the community might see her father's killer as a social vigilante who is justified in his actions because of the mistakes my father had made 17 years ago, adding, "If anyone had the right to be angry with my father, it was me, his primary victim." Some years before the murders, she'd gone to her father's doorstep to confront him about her childhood. "I found a guilt-stricken man who was suffering deeply from his past mistakes," she wrote. She and her father had been rebuilding a relationship since then. "I finally learned that my father was more than the sum of his worst acts. He was a human being, a real dad who did everything within his means to right his wrongs." A more detailed account of Eve Vasquez's history with her father appeared in the Spokesman Review almost exactly a year after the murders. According to that account, she grew up the oldest of 7 children in the Whatcom Valley. Her father worked as a logger until a workplace injury left him unable to continue, and the family fell into poverty. She said her father was abusive and that she was sexually abused by him beginning around age 8. The family situation deteriorated further. A brother died by self-checkout, and the children were eventually placed in separate foster homes in Bellingham after Vasquez was sentenced. Eve struggled afterward. She attempted self-checkout with pills at 14 and spent time in a juvenile group home in Spokane, before eventually rebuilding her own life. She finished high school, married at 19, had 2 children, divorced, and later worked as a housekeeper and at a bowling alley. After her father's release from prison and his move to Bellingham, Eve decided to seek him out. The following years, she made a number of trips from Spokane to Bellingham to see him, and the two of them talked by phone weekly. She last saw him in person on August 23, 2005, 4 days before he was killed. When she learned of the killing, a friend called her to say she saw her dad's house on the news. Eve worried she might be considered a suspect. She later wrote to the local paper defending her father's memory, helped plan his memorial service, and placed some of his ashes in a bay near a spot where the two of them used to talk. She kept the rest for a planned trip to Yellowstone. At Mullen's sentencing, she told the court, "My dad is dead, and I'm not ready for him to be dead." The killings reopened a debate in Washington over the state's 1990 Community Notification Law, the first of its kind in the country. Congress required all states to adopt some version of a sex offender registry in 1994. Bellingham Mayor Mark Asmunsen said, "I always wonder, when I look at many laws that are passed in relation to issues that are very emotional, is this a law that does good or just makes people feel like it did some good?" He said he wanted lawmakers to examine whether notification actually deterred sex crimes. John LaFond, a retired law professor, argued on behalf of the ACLU that research did not show that notification laws reduced sex offences or made them easier to solve, and that the laws instead made it harder for offenders to find housing, jobs, or to rebuild their lives. He said such laws virtually invite society to take the law into their own hands, and called them symbolic but futile gestures toward a difficult problem. He also noted that public policy too often gets built around the latest tragedy reported in the public media and the public's understandable anger and anguish about such terrible and unusual crimes. Ida Balasiates, a former state legislator who had served on the task force that recommended Washington's notification law, said the Bellingham killings didn't change her position. Considering the law's been in effect for 15 years plus, it's pretty remarkable that something like this hasn't happened before. She said the task force worried at the time about the potential for vigilante violence, but that concern had always been outweighed by one idea: no one wants to live around sex offenders, and they don't want them in their neighborhood. However, they do want to know if they're there, and I think they should know if they're there. She said she doubted the murders would lead to the law being loosened. Bellingham changed its own practice after the killings. The city's website listed offenders' exact addresses. Afterward, it listed only the street and block. Lieutenant Craig Ambrose said the department stopped posting addresses on its website altogether. Police nationally worried about copycat attacks on other registered offenders, but that didn't happen. Nearly a year after his arrest, in prison correspondence with Spokesman Review reporter Richard Rosler, Mullen said it was the case of Joseph Edward Duncan III that drove him to kill Ices and Vasquez. "Duncan is the straw that broke my back and forced me to go public with my fight," he wrote in an earlier letter to Seattle Times reporter Mike Carter, sent from the Whatcom County Jail. He wrote that his goal was to beat Duncan to death so I can be there when he arrives, adding, "It made me sick to think of the abuse Dylan suffered before he died, to be discarded like garbage." In his letter to Rosler, Mullen made 2 claims that Bellingham police said they couldn't verify. He said Ices and Vasquez weren't the first sex offenders he'd killed. Mullen talked about continuing to kill and identifying other targets, but police had no indication he actually followed through on any killings beyond the 2 he was convicted of. Mullen also said he videotaped the two men's final words and their deaths, and that the video would soon be released online as a warning to other sex offenders. The police had no indication a video existed. Mullen also wrote, of his crimes generally, "I want them to know that there are some of us in this world that will cross any boundary and law to stop them. This includes murder." He claimed he was sexually abused himself starting at age 5. "I was first befriended, manipulated, exploited, then sexually abused at the age of 5, he wrote. He said he eventually grew strong enough to fight back and became the hunter instead of the hunted. He wrote that he often thought about what Dylan Groene must have endured in captivity. "In my mind, I can see and feel the horror this boy endured before his death," he wrote. "We as a nation failed to protect these 3 beautiful children. Yeah, Duncan had a huge effect on me. I hope he suffers a brutal and slow death. Duncan is everything I hate in mankind. I wish they'd lock him in a prison cage with me." He told Rosler he was working on an autobiography, and that he was writing letters to welcome every child sex offender who arrived at a Washington state prison. His autobiography was never released because he didn't finish it. He was found dead in his cell on April 10, 2007, at age 36. Mullen apparently hoarded prescription medication and committed self-checkout by taking all the pills at once. He decided to go wait for Duncan in the afterlife. Joseph Edward Duncan III died on March 28, 2021, while on federal death row at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was diagnosed several months earlier with glioblastoma, an aggressive form of brain cancer. After undergoing brain surgery in October 2020, he declined chemotherapy and radiation treatment and died in a hospital outside the prison. If there is an afterlife, I hope Mullen got the confrontation with Duncan he spent his final years talking about.